I finally did it. After plenty of waiting, a month and a half of playing it, and 130 hours of total playtime, I finally finished Persona 5 Royal. While I do have my issues with the game, it's not hard to see what all the hype's about. From the soundtrack to the unique mechanics to the overwhelming sense of style, this game has a lot to offer. One of the things that stood out the most to me though was the palaces. By the time I finished the first one, I knew I wanted to do a video on them. I mean, they're levels based on people's minds. Sounds like another game I'm inevitably going to cover this year. So yeah, this is a ranking of every palace in the game. Before we start though, there's a few things I should clarify. For starters, I'm going to be judging these palaces on just about everything they have to offer. The visual design, the story surrounding it, the character whose palace it is, how well it tells their story, the gameplay, the boss fight. If you can think of it, I'm probably taking it into account. The other factor to keep in mind is that I've only played Royal, so I'm only counting those versions of the palaces here. Anyway, that's it for the rules. It's showtime. You know, it's kind of funny looking at general opinions on the palaces in this game. There isn't much of a consensus on which one's the best, but everyone can agree on the worst. Okumura's spaceport. There is so much wrong with this area. Let's start with the simplest problem, Okumura himself. As a character, he's one of the weakest of the palace rulers. He's not outright bad, but he is pretty generic. Like, if you asked me to envision what kind of villain would be in a game like this, Okumura is the exact guy I would picture with nothing to set him apart. Except maybe his daughter Haru, which brings me to my second problem with this palace, the story. In this chapter, we meet Haru, who wants to change her dad's heart because he's exploiting his workers and trying to marry her off to this creep. Now, that's a pretty interesting idea. It's like Yusuke's arc, but with enough of a twist to make it unique. The only problem is, that's not what this chapter's about. It's actually about Morgana and how he's left the group. Why? Well, because everyone else wants to be cautious and not go after Okumura right away because the sudden attention he's getting seems suspicious, which they turn out to be completely right about, and it's never even acknowledged that Morgana's the one who forced their hand. Also, Ryuji gets treated like the bad guy for insulting Morgana in this situation, despite Morgana insulting Ryuji basically every time he's talked to or about him. Seriously, what the hell? I know this arc is actually about Morgana feeling inadequate compared to all the new members who joined, and maybe I would feel sorry for him if he wasn't such an annoying narcissist all the time. Yeah, in case you can't tell, I freaking hate Morgana. The worst part of this storyline, aside from the full week where you literally can't do anything, is that it robs Haru of some much needed development. This was her one chance to get a major arc in the main story, but since it gets glossed over, she honestly feels like a background character compared to the other thieves, unless you do her social link, which is really good. Mona's so brazen about stealing her arc that in the big moment where Haru repudiates her father, the focus is put on Morgana refusing to betray his friends and join Okumura. Why would he join Okumura? He has nothing to gain. He has no emotional connection to him. He doesn't even know the guy. This is so stupid. But enough about the story. How's this place from a gameplay standpoint? The palace itself isn't that bad. I have a feeling some of it was cut for Royal because I was expecting way worse. Truth be told, there was a lot I liked here. The segment where you have to work your way up the chain of command by listening to people complain about their bosses was decently fun and a clever metaphor, and I could say the same about the assembly line segment. Plus, I do like the sci-fi aesthetic here. It can be a bit generic in some places, but it's gorgeous in others, and I like the design of the robots. Honestly, if they stopped right after you saw the robots being melted down, I would have no complaints with the dungeon itself. Unfortunately, it keeps going after that with these freaking airlock puzzles, which are needlessly confusing and take way too long. Want to know something funny? Everything up until now could have been just fine, and this would still be at the bottom of the list. Why? Okumura might just be the worst boss I've faced in a video game. His fight has way too many gimmicks that all work in tandem to create something truly horrible. The first phase has 5 waves of robots, and each wave has an elemental weakness. Now, resorting to regular enemies for your boss fight seems lazy, but not outright horrible. That's because we haven't gotten to the gimmick yet. You have to kill all 4 robots at once, or else the wave restarts. There's no story reason why, it just happens. Okay, so I can just target everyone with every attack. right? Well, no, because Okumura will boost the defense of one of them and only one, meaning you have to switch between attacking everyone and just that one robot. And you better do it quickly because Okumura might put in a sacrifice order, causing one of them to kamikaze and start the wave over again. But that doesn't even need to happen. Sometimes all the robots will randomly run away if you take too long to kill them. So this phase of the fight is practically designed to take forever, which is not only annoying, but will absolutely drain your SP since you have to exploit elemental weaknesses. And worst of all, the fight's on a time limit. A half-hour time limit that doesn't even stop during the dialogue. Why would you do that? Why are you incentivizing players not to enjoy your story? The only other game I've seen pull this is a Hat in Time Death Wish, and that was designed to be an overly sadistic challenge mode. I've heard people say you can cheese this phase in merciless mode, but that's only half true. Yeah, you can kill the robots quicker, but you better kill them quick, because if Okumura targets Joker or one of them pulls off a sacrifice order, you're probably dead. Plus, it won't help you in the next phase, which is mostly fine, except his Big Bang challenge attack, which is flashy and funny, but forces you to play defensively, which is not an option if you're low on time. Then the phase with Haru, while sad in concept, just left me terrified of being sent back to the beginning of the fight, so I wasn't exactly able to take in the emotions. Overall, Okumura's spaceport had a few cool ideas, but they were all botched by horrible execution, especially the boss fight. If you have me thinking to myself, God, I miss the meat circus, you have a big problem. If there's one word I would use to sum up the depths of Mementos, it would be unnecessary. Shido's palace, for all its issues, was a satisfying finale to this story. Just give us a really visceral scene of him confessing like with Kamoshida, and we're good. Instead, people don't seem to care about his confession. So the gang decides to get to the bottom of it, no pun intended, and we have a whole new chapter on our hands. To start with, you have to get to the bottom of Mementos just to access this place, so I hope you didn't assume that was optional. I mean, I knew in advance, but I can imagine how upset I'd be if I made that assumption. The dungeon itself, gameplay-wise, is fine. I thought those little light-up circle puzzles were fun. In fact, they're probably my favorite part of this chapter, which is not a good sign. While it's cool that you're descending deeper and deeper into a place already really far underground, the design isn't really interesting. It's just a bunch of black blocks with red lines on them. It's a bit eerie, but that's about it. These palaces tend to thrive off of their creative connections to the character they're based on, but this place just has a bunch of people who are apathetic about the world ending. I guess that says something about society, but it's so abstract it's not really interesting. Things go from bad to worse once you fight the Holy Grail. First off, why does no one think to cut the veins that are healing this thing? It's such an obvious thing to do, but nope, we gotta have our forced loss scenario. It gets revealed that the guy we thought was Igor was actually an imposter, and Caroline and Justine are actually one person, both of which are admittedly clever twists. Then you go around the Velvet Room and give pep talks to all your friends before heading off to the final battle. While it's admittedly cool to walk around the Velvet Room freely, giving 6 separate pep talks before you can move on gets pretty annoying. Then things really start sucking. You have to climb the stairway to heaven, which is filled with annoyingly strong enemies that have no weaknesses, and many of the fights are required before getting to the top where you fight Yaldi. I know that's not his full name, but he hasn't earned me using his full name. He's an even lamer villain than SIU Director. Yeah, that's what I'm calling him since he doesn't have a name. I get that it's Megami Tensei tradition for the final boss to be some sort of god, but that doesn't mean they have to hijack the story. Ameno Sagiri just served as a second phase for Adachi, had a much cooler design, and his ideals lined up closely with Adachi's. Here, it just feels like we're facing down a philosophy textbook instead of an actual villain, and we have to deal with him for an entire chapter. The fight itself is overly long and not very fun. I hope you like having to divert your attention to a bunch of different weapons while listening to a voice that's barely comprehensible underneath all the filters.
Even if a cliff of ruin lay ahead, these lemmings would march onward without a second thought.
Look at Devilman. He's almost crying just because of your stupid racist joke.
It's nowhere near as bad as Okumura though. It's just a typical JRPG final boss, which I'm not a fan of. itself. In the end, this whole chapter is a really lame way to end Persona 5. Shido was the perfect way to cap off the game's main conflict, but instead, it feels like an entirely different conflict was shoehorned in because it's a Megami Tensei game, so we need to kill a god at the end. Just because it's tradition doesn't mean it's fun. The segment's not as bad as Okumura's, but it's not as good either. It just feels like a void, and if I wasn't dedicated to making this video, I probably would have stopped somewhere on the stairway. I really didn't want to continue. Okay, so we're done with the outright bad palaces. On to more mixed territory, starting with Kanashiro's Bank. To start with, we have the storyline surrounding it. Makoto's storyline is really good. Seeing her go from being the principal's lapdog to a member of the Phantom Thieves is really satisfying to watch, even though it has very little to do with Kanashiro. Next, we have the palace itself. It's really disappointing. On the outside it looks cool. It's a giant flying bank that sucks up money from Shibuya, and all of Kanashiro's victims are literally walking ATMs, which is pretty funny. On the inside though, it's just a bank. There's no indication you're in the sky, and while there are some dreamlike exaggerations, it's not that interesting. Yeah, they've managed to make robbing a bank kinda boring. The one exception to this is the underground vault, which is lined with shelves of safe deposit boxes that form the vault's lock. It looks cool, but the puzzle surrounding it really isn't. It takes up half the palace and involves finding a bunch of different notebook pages to see which numbers match with which letters. I probably would have liked these puzzles if I knew how to pull up the notebook pages instead of having to memorize them, but the game just mentioned how to do it once and never brought it up again, which is pretty rare for this game. So I had to look up a walkthrough to solve these things. At least the codes are the same every time, so you can probably cheese your way through this part Mimi style. I don't know for sure though. Unfortunately, this puzzle isn't even the biggest annoyance here. No, that would be the security cameras. If you step into their line of sight, it raises the security level. You can clearly see them with your thief vision, but in normal gameplay, the lights they give off are so faint you can barely notice them. And since the cameras blend in with the scenery, I would constantly get the security level raised because I forgot these things existed. Despite all those annoyances, there is one other upside of this palace, and that's Kanashiro himself. He's not the best villain in the game, Maruki Kamishita and Akechi blow him out of the water, but he is weirdly entertaining. I mean, just look at this guy. He looks like if Mello from Death Note gained a ton of weight and had a rage comic surgically grafted to his face. Now, that's already funny, but it's even funnier when you stuff him in a business suit, give him a little mustache, and turn his skin purple.
What the hell is that?
Well, it ain't Barney the purple dinosaur!
I get that he's supposed to be intimidating, and in the beginning, he kind of is, but by the end, his sophisticated facade drops entirely, and he starts talking like an awkward white rapper. His boss fight is absolutely hilarious, and as a result, it's my favorite in the game. I mean, come on, how could you go wrong with Piggytron? So yeah, Kanashiro's palace had a lot of good stuff, but the bad stuff was too much for it to rank any higher. And now for the palace that should have been the finale. If I were to describe Shido as a villain, I'd say he's perfectly adequate. He does everything his role in the game needs him to. No more and no less. I wasn't disappointed by him, nor was I impressed. He probably would have been better if he had more screen time instead of being hidden behind SIU director. Seriously, was anyone surprised this guy was the main villain? The idea behind Shido's palace is really cool. Obviously, it takes place inside of the Diet building as he's trying to become prime minister. But the building's been turned into a luxury cruise liner sailing through the flooded remains of Japan with a beautiful yet ominous sunset in the background. And unlike Kanashiro's palace, you get to see this view pretty often. As for the inside, it's about as grandiose of a resort as you can get. Filled with Shido's people, all wearing masks of their own, and megaphones blasting Shido's speeches, showing just how self-absorbed he is. The environment is vibrant and has a good deal of variety to it, and the palace music seriously slaps. The goal of this palace is really unique, as the treasure is right near the beginning in the representative's chamber, but you can't get to it. In order to get through the doors, you need a letter of recommendation from all 5 members of Shido's inner circle. Each member shows off a different aspect of Shido's massive criminal operation, and each party member gets a chance to shine when trying to get the letter from them. The fight with Shido is really cool too. He starts off riding a golden lion made out of people, which quickly changes to a couple different forms until he ditches the people and goes full Senator Armstrong on you, eventually culminating in a one-on-one duel, all while the best boss theme in the game plays. This fight might not be as fun as some of the others, but God is it cool. Way better than Yaldi. So what's the catch? I said all this nice stuff, and the palace is pretty far down on the list, so there's gotta be some sort of catch, right? Sadly, yes. Actually, there's 2 of them. For starters, there's the Shido statues. These things turn your whole group into rats, which leads to a lot of really annoying puzzles in cramped corridors with vents so small you won't even notice them half the time. And they show up a lot. The other issue is the fight with Akechi. The fight itself is fine and very emotional. My problem is its placement. He shows up with no warning immediately after you make it through the brutal fight with the cleaner. So if you're low on items or want to switch out party members, sucks for you! You've got 3 phases of pain ahead of you. I hope you saved immediately before fighting the cleaner in case you need to chicken out. Yeah, I was powering through the palace in one go, and I was almost out of healing items by the time Akechi showed up. I managed to beat him without having to retreat to a safe room, but just barely. Which is a shame, as I feel like I really would have enjoyed this boss otherwise. Alright, now we're getting to the good stuff, starting with Futaba's Pyramid. Visually, the pyramid isn't anything special, but in terms of design, it's pretty good. To start with, you go into a town to steal back a piece of parchment, which is really unique for this game. As for the pyramid itself, I think it's a bit dull in the beginning, but it just keeps getting better as it goes. The chambers on the main floor are a lot of fun and offer a decent variety in puzzles. The boss is the weak link here. It's not bad, but it's not as interesting as most of the other palace bosses. You may have noticed I haven't said anything about the story of this palace yet, and that's because it's easily the strongest part. It probably is the most intrigue of any of the game's chapters. It foreshadows that you'll be going up against an anonymous hacking group, and then you're quickly messaged by the mysterious hacker Alibaba. Not gonna lie, Alibaba's pretty intimidating the first time you encounter him. You have no clue what this guy's capable of, or why he wants you to go after Futaba Sakura. Then the story almost shifts to a mystery, trying to figure out who Futaba is. Not just her either. We finally figure out what Sojiro's deal is too. Up until now, he's just come across as kind of an asshole, who maybe has a soft side, but we don't really know. They entertain the idea that he might be up to something, which makes it all the more impactful when you realize what's really going on. Futaba's backstory, how she's psychologically unable to leave her room, and the fact Sojiro's been doing everything he can to take care of her. It all makes it so satisfying when Futaba takes a stand at the end of the palace and literally fights against the traumatic and outright false thoughts that have been tormenting her for so long. Also, the section afterward where the Phantom Thieves are training her to interact with people and go out in public is both incredibly wholesome and pretty funny. Also, I know this is an unpopular opinion, but I do like Futaba as a character. As an introvert with mild autism, I low-key relate to her, and she's adorably dorky. I get that people don't like her because of her cringe gamer references, but I didn't find them that bad. Maybe they're toned down in Royal, I don't really know. One of the most important parts of a game is its beginning. It teaches you how to play, shows you what you can expect from the game, and gives you an idea of whether or not you'll like it. And RPGs are infamous for being terrible at these, which is probably why Persona 5's opening act is so highly regarded. It does a great job of teaching you the mechanics while still being incredibly engaging. The target here is Kamoshida, who's easily the best villain in the base game, which is kind of funny when you think about it. You have all these mafia kingpins and political masterminds, and they're outclassed by a freaking high school volleyball coach. I think one of the reasons for this is just how much screen time he's given compared to most of the other villains. He actually seems like a nice guy when you first see him, but it quickly gets revealed just how much of a scumbag he is. This guy is utterly disgusting, and it's not hard to see how he pushed Joker and Ryuji to get involved with the metaverse. He's also pretty intimidating, both in his shadow form where he commands massive power you're not used to dealing with, and in his human form, where he has your entire school wrapped around his finger. I also love how he's wronged Joker, Ryuji, and An, all in different ways, so they all have similar but different reasons for wanting to take him down. I'm glad they spent as much time as they did building this guy up, because it really paid off. As for his palace, it's also really good. I'm not the biggest fan of the tower, as it's filled with beginner's traps like the swinging blade puzzle, which left me confused regarding what got saved when you died. The same could be said for the safe room at the end, which I missed my first time around, making it impossible to get to Kamoshida with all the beefed up enemies after I sent the calling card. All I can say is, thank God I saved before sending the calling card. Otherwise, I would have been screwed. I know a lot of this stuff is kind of nitpicky, but this is a personal list, and it's the first area, so I think me being stupid is a somewhat valid complaint, if only somewhat. The rest of the palace, though, is great. It looks cool, the puzzles are fun, and it serves as a great introduction to the gameplay. I've heard some complain about the tutorials, but I like the way they were handled. This game has a lot of mechanics, and I'd rather have the lessons be spread out instead of crunched together so I forget what half of them were. Even the boss does a great job of giving you an idea of what the bosses are like while still being fun and exciting. Finally, the ending is really satisfying. Seeing this bastard squirm after being beaten is great, and his confession is even better. It makes me wish they didn't gloss over the confession scenes as the game went on. I get not doing it every time, but come on, at least give us the full confession from Shido instead of having him be carried away by his goons halfway through. In the end, Kamoshida's castle was a strong start with only a few minor hiccups, but I've still got 3 palaces I like more. Maybe it's just me, but I really like museum levels. They're not my favorite level type, but I usually have a good time when one pops up. They allow for a lot of variety and have an overall nice atmosphere. So maybe that's why I like Monarame's palace so much. The interior of the museum looks really nice. The golden walls and pale blue carpets make for a good color scheme, and there are so many areas of the museum, both inside and out, that are a feast for the eyes. A lot of the set pieces and security systems made me feel more like a thief than any of the other palaces, mainly because of moments like when you have to free your teammates from the laser beams, and the end where you have to come up with an elaborate heist plan to get the treasure. The best parts, though, are when this palace gets really creative with the art theme. There are moments where you jump into paintings and travel through them, and segments in this cool, abstract pocket dimension. I especially love the one where you have to recognize the correct version of the Sayuri. The fight with Monarame is one of my favorite bosses in the game. The heist leading up to it is pretty sweet, the phase with all his paintings is a bit confusing, but still fun to figure out, and his final phase is even better, and the elemental clones look really cool. As for the story of this place, that's where things get a bit more mixed, but still overall positive. For starters, this chapter introduces Yusuke, who's a lot of fun, and having him go from an antagonist to one of your allies is pretty satisfying. Monarame, on the other hand, is one of the weaker villains in the game. He's a lot like Shido. He serves his purpose fine, but that's about it. His psychological grip on Yusuke is the most notable thing about him, and even then, I think that tells us more about Yusuke than him. Also, he's weirdly tame for a villain in this game. Yeah, letting a woman die so you can steal her painting is awful, but that's small potatoes compared to people like Kaneshiro and Okumura. And then we come to the most infamous part of this chapter, the nude model scene. A lot of people have called this scene problematic, and while I don't usually get wrapped up in that stuff, I kind of agree. Having An be pressured by the gang into modeling nude is a terrible idea, especially when you consider her arc with Kamoshida. And the weird thing is, they could have fixed it really easily. Just have An volunteer to do it. It could be an empowering moment about taking back her sexuality. And since she still wouldn't intend to strip for Yusuke, you can keep the scene virtually the same, which is good because the scene itself is both really funny and gives Yusuke some great development. So overall, the story has a few problems, but is still pretty good, and the palace itself is fantastic. There's a reason I specified at the beginning that I was talking about Royal. Sure, the original palaces were remixed in some ways, and that's worth clarifying, but what's more important is the extra palace they added. And given the fact I'm focusing on that now, it should be clear which one's next. Much like Kamoshida's, it takes a while before you can explore it normally, and that's because it really takes its time to set the scene. At the end of the main game, when Joker would normally turn himself in to ensure Shido's prosecution, Akechi shows up and turns himself in instead.
Yeah, I don't get this either. Pretty sure I died.
The new year comes and things are off, to say the least. Ryuji's back on the track team, Wakaba, Okumura, and Makoto's father are all still alive, Okumura and Madarame are seemingly good people now, Shiho's coming back to Shujin, and Morgana's Nagito.
I am happy right now, but I just can't accept the situation as it is.
God, imagine if he had that voice the entire game. So yeah, things are suspiciously nice, and Akechi and Kasumi are the only ones who seem to notice anything wrong. So the three of you go to the palace and find out that Dr. Maruki is behind this. I'm not gonna go into too much detail with him because I plan to talk about him in an upcoming video. All I'll say is that he's easily my favorite villain in the game. Then, after getting a good glimpse of what this new world's really like, a great character arc from Sumire that ties into Maruki's motives, getting the gang back together, and even going through a whole new section of mementos, you finally get to the palace. To start with, the visuals are fantastic. This palace goes through like 5 different looks as you move through it, and each one looks really cool and fits with the theme of this laboratory that also doubles as a mental hospital. I can't go through everything as this palace is really long, but there are 2 standout segments. For starters, there's the final segment, where you enter this strange, beautiful paradise where you adjust colors on these panels to make bridges and barriers appear and disappear. The puzzle's fun and the scenery is great. Second is the psychological exam segment, which makes you answer a few questions. These questions are really interesting because they're all dilemmas that seem inherently subjective, but you can't answer them according to what you would do. You have to figure out what Maruki would want you to do. And while the game makes it clear what the right answer is, and there's not much of a consequence for failure, it's still a really interesting thought experiment. Despite the fantastic atmosphere and story, and some great gameplay moments, I do have a few problems with this palace. For starters, it's really long, which I'm not actually sure if I have a problem with, but I figured I'd mention it. My bigger issue is that this palace is a pretty sizable difficulty spike, and the boss is a difficulty spike on top of the difficulty spike. Granted, I sidestepped these issues when playing by doing the palace on easy and Maruki on safe, but that doesn't make it not an issue. I'm also not the biggest fan of the final boss, but that might just be me disliking overly long RPG final bosses. It's definitely better than Yaldi. Believe it or not, Maruki's lab was originally going to be number 1 on the list, but the more I thought about it, the more issues I had, and the more I realized my number 1 had to be at the top. It's kinda crazy how much there is to like about Say's Casino. To start with, just look at this place. It may just be a casino, but it's so vibrant and flashy and colorful. If I had to pick an area that best summed up this game's aesthetic, at least as far as the palaces go, it would be this place. The story leading up to this palace isn't anything special, but the way it plays out inside is really cool. Sai is a prosecutor, and over the years she's lost her way and become concerned only with winning cases and advancing her career. How does this manifest in her palace? Well, rather than trying to stop you right out of the gates, she challenges you to come find her and acts as if it'll be a fair fight, but then rigs all the rules against you. So this entire level revolves around rigging casino games in your favor. That concept's unique enough to be a level from Psychomons. Thankfully, it's not just a good concept. The execution's fun as well. Each game has you rigging it in a different way. The game of dice has you go behind the scenes to find the control room so you can rig the odds in your favor, and the slots have you hunting down a bunch of different control panels so you can hit the jackpot with a giant slot machine. Things get even better on the next floor. There's the House of Darkness, where you have to travel through a darkened maze, avoiding enemies and crawling through air ducts just to get to the end. Finally, there's the Battle Arena, where Joker has to fight in battles that are rigged against him, all while a hilariously biased announcer narrates them.
Bullshit! Why the hell aren't you dying, you goddamn Phantom Queen? I have a bet on this coup!
Finally, the gang gets to the bridge, where Sai shows just how willing she is to break her own rules, and Akechi shows how he predicted that exact reaction. The fight with Sai is fun too. It maintains the flashiness of the rest of the level, and has a unique gimmick. Sai will constantly spin the wheel to change her affinity, and the only element that can properly damage her is the opposite of that affinity. For example, if she rolls nuclear, nuke damage gets reflected and all other damage types except for psychic are weaker. It really is a unique gimmick. However, everything I've said up until now isn't even the highlight of this place. That comes immediately after the fight. You see, everything in the game up until now has essentially been a flashback, and this is when things finally catch up to the present. Enemies are closing in, so Joker serves as a distraction, and we get to replay the opening sequence of the game. And while it was cool originally, it's even cooler now that you have the full context. After skipping all of Sai's interrogation, Joker gives her the cryptic instruction to show Akechi his phone, and then Akechi kills Joker. Oh no, who could have seen this coming? Except Joker's not actually dead. And shortly afterward, it gets explained why, how the gang figured out Akechi was going to betray them, and the convoluted yet brilliant plan to get Joker out of there safely, and figure out who Akechi's working for. This whole sequence is my favorite story moment in the whole game. The tension is high, the buildup has essentially been happening the entire game, and the payoff is so satisfying. I am Defophilizer, and around this point in the game, I was planning to stop for a bit and take a break from Persona 5, but there's no way I could stop after something this cool. If only they kept that momentum going until the end.